Nancy Toomey to Neighbors and Friends. Nancy's a published novelist and a serious writer who also teaches writing at Montclair State. We invited her to the program to ask her how she goes about developing student writers in her classes. We'll also ask her what she thinks about the state of writing at the beginning of the second decade of the 21st century. So, what are your impressions of the writing abilities your students demonstrate?
Well, I do have to say, it all depends on the mix of kids in a classroom at any given time. You can pretty much run the gamut where you'll have some students who are very enthusiastic about writing and understand that they have a talent for it, or at least have been told that they have an ability to write, either at high school level or maybe younger. And then you may have some who have a really negative feeling about writing, who are very hesitant and lack confidence in their writing. So it pretty much runs across the board. One of the things I see most of the time in freshman composition writing classes, which is primarily what I'm teaching, is that students have been taught to take their own personal voice out of their writing as they learn essay writing when they're younger.
Oh dear.
And what we really have to do is encourage them to have the confidence to have their own voice heard through what it is that they're saying in their work.
Yeah, when I was doing writer workshops some years ago, it was always a problem to bring out in people the freedom to express themselves in their own words. Don't really seem to have too much trouble talking about themselves with their friends.
Right.
But when it comes to sitting there at the computer or at a typewriter or even with a pad and pen, it's a little more daunting for them, and then they just lack confidence.
Mm-hmm.
So some of the exercises that we did were pretty basic. One of them was to write a 2-page biography, autobiography, in your own words about your own life. Well, they sort of can do that, but not always with a lot of confidence. In talking about reading and writing, there was an op-ed piece in the New York Times recently by E.D. Hirsch, who has written about education, which is our general topic here. He is the author of The Making of Americans, Democracy and Our Schools. And in the Times op-ed piece, he was decrying the fact that reading and writing scores on the SAT continue to decline year by year, despite the emphasis in schools today on reading and writing. There are a lot more than a single school of thought concerning teaching writing, and some critics suggest it's an impossible thing to do. What do you think? Can anybody learn to write?
Well, yes, I believe that anybody can learn to write. Not everybody can write well, but everybody can develop the skills that they need to communicate on paper. And I think the most important thing that you can ask students to do to enable them to feel that they have the confidence to actually take on the task of writing is to have them read, to have them just read a lot of different types of work. I had with my 2 freshman classes that I'm just starting to teach this year, since it's September, I asked my students, I said, how many of you have actually read essays at the high school level? And in 2 classes of 20 students each, only one of the boys raised his hand and said that he actually read an academic essay in high school. So what we did in the following class was I brought in an essay and we read an essay together. And we basically spent the entire class period dissecting the essay and taking it apart and showing them what the rhetorical strategies were that the writer used and how he put the piece together so that they could see a piece of work that they could imitate.
It's puzzling to me that so little emphasis at the secondary school level is placed on writing anything. I mean, the schools in New Jersey are not by any means the worst in the country when it comes to SAT scores. In fact, we're just about at the top of the list. On the other hand, as you're describing, freshmen in college haven't read an essay and certainly haven't written one. And if they even know what the form is, they're not sure about it.
Well, I think they've written them, but what I've seen in some of the private tutoring that I've done is that a lot of times at the high school level, a teacher will ask them to write an essay, but won't give them models or forms to follow. And so that kind of undermines their confidence, because they kind of, when a high school student sees the word essay, they think essay test.
Yeah.
And they're looking for a prompt, and they're looking for something that they believe the teacher is expecting as an answer. So you're right, they don't take on that freedom to go ahead and just kind of expand on a basic idea.
How do you deal
and write an
with that
essay.
in your classes?
We do things like when I make assignments, when I design assignments for them to do essays, I don't ask them specific questions in the explanation of what I'd like them to do. I ask them to explore ideas. I ask them to consider ideas. I ask them to compare different kinds of ideas from different writers. And I don't ask them to answer any specific question. I challenge them to come up with their own question and then to answer their own question.
That sounds like a really good plan to me. You're a writing teacher and an English teacher. When did you first discover you were a writer? No, tell the truth.
Okay, when I probably first discovered that I had an ability to write when I was in high school, and it was not in an English class, it was in a history class. And we all had to write some kind of response to something the teacher asked us to do, and we submitted our, if you want to call them essays, we probably called them reports back then. And my teacher nominated my essay to a contest. And I was totally surprised that he selected my essay out of the entire classes to submit to a contest. And I didn't win the contest, but that was the first time anybody noticed that I knew how to put sentences and paragraphs and concepts together. So that was early. I think that was in junior year in high school.
How did you feel about that?
I felt great. I didn't really understand the significance of it at the time. I was kind of a shy, retiring person who didn't really take compliments well. So
what did you do about this discovery that you could write? What was the next step?
Oh boy, there really wasn't a next step for a very long time, because I was very busy. I was very busy trying to get through college and working part-time at college and just doing what I was expected to do, and getting out of college and getting a job. And I always enjoyed reading. And I always had this thing in the back of my head that someday I would write a book. And I think that notion came from Louisa May Alcott when I was a kid, and I read, about Jo, who became a writer out of the four sisters, and that fantasy of someday being a published writer just kind of lodged itself in the back of my mind. And it stayed there in the back for a very long time.
Who were the teachers, the friends, the colleagues, the family members who helped you develop your own evolution as a writer?
Okay. I grew up in a family with I had a very Irish grandfather who.
So did I.
Really? Yes, he was a Newark policeman, and when he was a retired Newark policeman, he sat in his chair with a book for as much of the time as he possibly could. And there was actually a time in his life when my mom was getting him books out of the Vailsburg branch of the Newark Public Library, and she got to the point where she felt like he had read every book, because every time she brought a book home to him, he would open it, he'd say, "I've read this one," and he'd put it aside. So she actually had to change branch libraries because he was such an active reader. And my mom was a very active reader. When I was a child, or a young adult, our summers were spent at home in the backyard pool, and we would take a weekly trip, or more frequently, to the library. And that's what we did. We would take a dip in the swimming pool, and then we'd sit under a tree with a book for the rest of the afternoon.
I think some of us were born to be readers. My first library card, I was 5, I think, and I roller skated to the library in my neighborhood in Chicago. And the same thing after we moved east. library denizens. It's a great way to start. As you developed as a writer, how did you, what steps did you take to improve your writing skills?
Well, when I realized that I really wanted to seriously write, I started with a workshop. And I started with a workshop where we were challenged to write while we were in the workshop. And we were looking for ideas from our own lives as concepts for short stories and, and essays. And what that taught me was the importance of sharing your work with other writers and having someone else's eye on your work and responses from other people to your work so that you could refine your technique.
One of the things that some writing teachers say is write what you know about, or write what you know. And I always add a caveat to that, but not only what you know, what you can find out about.
Right.
James Michener made an entire career out of finding out about things and then writing about them.
With my first book, I didn't follow that rule about write what you know. My young adult novel is about Pinochet's Chile. And I've never visited that country, but I was captivated by the stories in the New York Times about Pinochet being arrested back in the 90s, and did a lot of research, and that really was my first completed work. And it was all based on research.
Research is great. How much influence on your own work was the reading that you did and still do of other writers?
Other writers are a very, very strong influence. As a matter of fact, in this book about Chile, I was reading Gabriel Garcia Marquez because
Right.
he was the magic realism. He was the star, the star, I would say, of magic realism that came out of the Latin American countries. And I was reading Isabel Allende's to influence me because she was a Chilean writer.
Right.
That was for that particular project. But yes, very, very strong influences from Flannery O'Connor, who is probably one of my favorite writers. I did a lot of reading of C.S. Lewis's essays about 10 years ago, and that has had a strong influence on some of the things that I write about. Who else? Let's see, Margaret Atwood.
Oh, yeah.
Who's a great writer.
Here's a challenge. What advice do you offer your students, especially those that you think have a special talent for writing?
Well, I tell them that they should have a great respect for their talent, and they shouldn't take it for granted. Because a lot of young people don't realize that their ability is not shared by a lot of other people. And I also tell them that writing is very hard work. There's this tendency to kind of romanticize the profession of writing. And basically what I tell them is you need to work at a work ethic, and you need to write every day. And writing is just like any other work. It doesn't come easily. You have to sit there and you have to wait.
Hold that thought. We'll be right back.
I have no idea.
Panic.
I have no idea what it is, never heard of it.
I have no idea.
Some sort of virus or something?
There's cases of it all over the world. A whole lot of cases of flu in the community.
I had a grandmother who died in 1918 from the flu.
A flu pandemic is a worldwide outbreak of a type of flu that we have not been exposed to before. My patients ask me why there could be such a concern with the flu. The answer is that a flu pandemic is not the seasonal flu. A flu pandemic is caused by a new virus that could spread quickly from person to person. It could cause widespread illness and death faster than we can produce a vaccine. While this news upsets some people, I tell my patients that they should see this as an opportunity to plan for themselves, their families, and their communities.
Don't have a clue.
Lock myself in my house.
Have hand sanitizer with me at all times.
I would just take a lot of vitamin C.
Hygiene, washing hands a lot.
I would change my diet.
I would get A whole lot of ibuprofen?
Not really, no.
Build a bunker underneath your house.
We know that New Jersey citizens have very different levels of understanding when it comes to the possibility of a flu pandemic. Regardless of how much you know, you need to know that there are steps you should take right now to prepare. The worst thing you can do is nothing at all. Now first, day-to-day precautions can protect you and your family. Practice healthy habits like washing hands, covering coughs and sneezes, and staying home when you're sick. These are things you should do anyway to stop the spread of germs. Second, create an emergency plan that you and those close to you know well. Third, get involved in community planning for a flu pandemic. Contact local community organizations and leaders to learn what they are doing. And finally, know that the state of New Jersey has created planning information for everyone. Whether you're a business person, a teacher, a healthcare provider, or a stay-at-home parent, these resources are tailored for you. This information and the most up-to-date knowledge are available at www.njflupandemic.gov. Together, we'll be better prepared.
I really do need to talk to my family about this.
Talk to your family.
I'm going to talk to my parents.
Contact the health department.
Go on the website.
I'll go online. That seems easy.
Public education. Make sure that everybody knows it's out there and what resources are available.
I'm New Jersey Health Commissioner Dr. Fred Jacobs. New Jersey is preparing, and you should too. Now get flu ready, New Jersey.
Get flu ready.
Get flu ready.
Get flu ready, New Jersey.
Get flu ready.
Get flu ready.
Get flu ready, New Jersey.
Get flu ready.
Get flu ready, New Jersey!
Nancy, as a married mom of some school-age and college-age children who also teaches, how do you manage to fit your personal writing into that kind of a schedule, considering that your available time is not exactly elastic?
No, it's not. I read a book a while ago that was a series of interviews with women writers. And one of my favorite writers, whose name is Lynn Sharon Schwartz, I loved her novel, which was called Disturbances in the Field. It's one of my favorite novels. But anyway, she said in her interview, she said, you can't be a good girl and be a writer. So she was talking about all those things that are involved with motherhood, PTA, volunteer work, you know. I mean, I did coach softball for 10 years, but that was like my one indulgence.
Me too.
But basically,
5, not 10.
But basically, you have to say no to a lot of things if you really want to carve out time in your schedule to write. And what I managed to do was get up very early in the morning, and if I had to, I would write an appointment for myself on my own personal calendar, and that would be my writing time. And if anything threatened to interfere with that, or somebody called me and said, could you do something for me at this time, I would just kind of consult my calendar and say, no, I'm sorry, I'm busy. I didn't have to tell them what I was doing, that I was sitting in a room all by myself staring at a computer screen waiting for inspiration, but that was my way of finding the time for myself.
That sounds like a good plan. Some years ago when I was doing writers' conferences and writers' workshops, and people would say, you know, I've got a husband and a house and a family and my church and everything else, and I don't have time.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say, write 1 page a day.
That's all you need to do.
1 page a day, 365 days a year. That's a manuscript.
And that's a book. That's right.
Now, rewriting, that's another question altogether. But you can get one done. If you stay up an hour later, get up an hour earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe sometimes don't do the dishes before you go to bed.
Right. Let them pile up.
Do your kids write at all? I mean, you mentioned that they're really dancers for the most part.
Well, yeah, we have one who's an actor, we have one who's a dancer, and we have one who's kind of not sure about where she's headed academically. But one of the girls said to me one day, Mom, I do not want to be a writer. Writers have a boring life. All they do is sit in a room all day, all by themselves, and, you know, put words on the page or words on the computer. And she said, I don't want to write. But I do notice that she keeps a journal. You know, I'll find it under her pillow, or I'll see that it's in her purse, and I see that their pages are filling up. So she does have that interest in recording some of her thoughts and her feelings, but
what she doesn't want to do is to share them with her mom just yet.
Exactly.
Which is a good thing.
Exactly.
Writing is, to me, the most private thing you can do in expressing yourself in art, until the time comes when it gets published. And then it's out in the world and off of your desk, out of your computer, and making its own way or not.
Right. It's like it's like giving birth to a baby in a way.
And do you have any personal advice for people who have, by intention or accident, decided to be writers?
Read a lot. Read more than you write. Observe everything. Use sensory detail, or observe with sensory detail everything that you experience. And have the confidence to experiment. Have confidence to write a whole lot more on the page than you think you're going to actually end up with. You can always, you can record as much as you want, and then you craft it later in the revision process. And one of the most important things, I think, is to develop a community of support with other writers. I think it is a lonely profession, it is a lonely pursuit, and you really do need to be among what I call aliens from the same planet that you came from. Because writers are a certain type of personality, and it's very refreshing to know that there are others on the planet who are in pursuit of the same thing you are.
This is probably a good time to bring up the fact that we met in such an environment. Nancy and I did.
That's right. We did.
We're both members of an organization in Montclair and elsewhere called MEWS, M-E-W-S, which is an acronym that I won't bother explaining. But it is a community of writers and editors and people who care about writing and who care about books. Agents, editors, people from publishing, people not from publishing, people whose primary output is a grocery list, but they're thinking that there's going to be something more one day. Have you noticed among your students in college any preferences in writing about a particular topic or a genre? And if so, what are they? What are they reading?
They're not reading a lot of things that I recognize. And I think one of the saddest things is they don't really engage with the classics. There's this kind of new young mentality that if it's not new, it's not cool.
No.
And it's only until it's only when you get to graduate school that I've seen that some people start to recognize that some of the old canonic literature is something that they've missed out on, and that they should go back and kind of reacquaint themselves.
The thing that always impelled me when I was a literary agent was, if I was going to understand how to market various genre of writing, I better understand what they were. So I read young adult novels, I read science fiction, I read westerns, I read mysteries and suspense and so on. And out of each of those categories of writing, I learned things about structure, about characterization, about descriptions. Some were more highly developed than others. Well, there's one other thing that I want to go back to the Hirsch article in the Times, because it's very significant to why the kids in your classes aren't writing better, because they're not challenged to write better, and they're not challenged to write at all enough in elementary, middle, and secondary schools. That when the teachers are more interested to develop kids who can pass the HESPA tests,
Right.
rather than developing their skills as readers and writers.
Mm-hmm.
How do you feel about that?
Well, I really do feel like this whole movement toward teaching to the test does a disservice to students. I think it infringes on their creativity. I think it restricts the teacher and what creativity they can bring to the classroom to encourage the students to do more writing. One of the things that I did notice when I was tutoring some students who were writing their college essays, that they were married to 5-paragraph form. And that's what they learn in middle school, that's what they're expected to kind of adhere to as they go through high school, because that's what they get tested on in the SAT and the PSAT. So when you introduce to them the concept that they can move away from that form, there's this hesitancy. So you have to encourage them to unlearn certain writing behaviors before they can learn new ones.
How hard is it for your college students to adapt to expanding their own abilities as writers and readers? And what do you do to encourage that?
It's actually the challenge of doing freshman composition classes,
Mm-hmm.
because you do want to break the old habits, but you also want to keep the abilities that they have acquired. So we do a lot of free writing, and then we mine the free writes for concepts. They share those concepts with each other, and then they kind of help each other hone them down into, if you want to call them central claims or central themes for their papers.
How would you describe free writing as an exercise?
Free writing can be an extremely intimidating thing for a student, but basically what you do is you give them a piece of paper and you have them touch the paper with the pen point, and you say, ready, set, go. I don't care what you write. You cannot lift the pen from the page, and you just keep going. Let your mind go wherever it wants to go. Don't steer it, and just do it. And sometimes you'll see them sitting there frozen, with their thoughts frozen, because they've been given no expectations. They've been given no flaming hoop to jump through.
And no directions.
And no directions. And it's a freeing thing. And then when we go back and we read them, what we can do is we can mine them for the gems of thoughts that they didn't realize that they were experiencing.
Right. The thing that I've always found about working with young writers is they're better than they think they are.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times.
Mm-hmm.
And they see a lot more than they are aware that they're seeing, and they hear more than they think they're hearing. And it's an opportunity as a teacher to help them discover where their mother loads are as far as their personalities and their information is concerned.
Mm-hmm. Yes, they don't have to adhere to any particular ideas when they do that. So what you're doing is you're legitimizing their own ideas and finding the uniqueness, which I think is the most important, one of the most important things.
I guess the last thing I want to ask you, if you have any personal advice for those poor souls who declare themselves to be writers, what should they do? How do you get started, and then what happens? Let's say you recognize from an assignment that you've given your classes that there are several kids or students, we're going to call them kids, who may have a little something extra.
Mm-hmm.
How do you encourage that discovery?
Well, I think the first thing you have to do is just let them know that you've recognized it, obviously. Suggest to them that they take additional classes. If they have a bent toward creative writing, encourage them to take literature classes and explore more written work and to see what kinds of things resonate with them. And if they really do have an ability, then they can basically just start by journaling. And from journaling, sit in a desk or at a computer or with a notebook for a certain number of hours a day or a certain number of minutes a day, and just let these things flow out of your hand and onto the page. And one of the most important things they can do is find mentors, or either mentor writers that whose work they will read, or teachers that can encourage them and create and show them how to find their way through being proud of their work and getting their work to a polished finish so that they can be submitted.
Before we wrap things up, Nancy, do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share?
Yes, I want to read this quote that I brought with me, that I hang on the bulletin board over my own desk at home. And this is advice to people who are interested in writing. And basically, this is from a woman named Janet Frame, and she says, "The only certainty about writing and trying to be a writer is that it has to be done, not dreamed of or planned and never written or talked about. The ego eventually falls apart like a soaked sponge, but simply written. It's a dreadful, awful fact that writing is like any other work."
Thank you very much, Professor Nancy Toomey, for appearing on Neighbors and Friends. I think your views will encourage other writers, and your students are fortunate to have you as a teacher.
Well, thank you for having me.
You're quite welcome. This is your moderator, Charles Neighbors. Thanks for tuning in to Neighbors and Friends. Meantime, in the immortal words of poet W.B. Yeats, education is not the filling of a pail, but the lighting of a fire. And until we meet again, remember, writers write.